Research Retrospectives is a series of conversations with researchers, asking them to reflect on their careers and their path through research. So our guest today is Zoubin. He is a distinguished scientist and senior research director for Google Brain. And before he was here, he was at Uber with the purple t-shirts. Zoubin has focused on probabilistic approaches for machine learning and AI. Welcome, Zoubin. We're so glad to have you.
Thanks, Katherine.
So to start things off, Zoubin, I want to do a little bit of memory exercise with you. Please know that it's not designed to make you look bad. Actually, either way, will make you look good, because if you don't pass the exercise, that just means that you have so many great work that is, it's overflowing your memory. But if you do remember, that just means you're great at memorizing things. So do you remember your PhD dissertation title? I know that's 30 years ago or something.
Yeah, I think the title was Computation and Psychophysics of Sensory Motor Control.
Wow, that's 90% correct. Sensor motor integration.
Close enough.
Do you happen to know your most cited paper?
My most cited paper is probably the paper on graph-based semi-supervised learning.
Mm-hmm.
And I don't know if that's exactly the title. We wrote a few papers on that topic.
Yeah, that's accurate. It is semi-supervised learning using Gaussian field and harmonic functions. Do you happen to remember your most cited deep learning era paper that is like post 2012?
Yeah, it's on dropout as an approximate. I don't know the title. Dropout is an approximate Bayesian inference. Might be close enough to the title.
Yeah, awesome. It's dropout as a Bayesian approximation. What has been your most fun project to work on?
It's hard to say because I've worked on so many things over so many years, but probably my undergraduate thesis, which was a long time ago. So this is like around 1989, submitted in 1990. It was one of the first projects I did in machine learning. It was actually on neural networks. It was on neural networks for parsing natural language. And back then, like, there wasn't a lot of code for this stuff, so you had to sort of write all the code yourself. Compute was pretty lacking, let's say, compared to now. But where I was an undergrad at UPenn, we had this thing called a connection machine, which you should look it up. It looks like something from science fiction. It's this big black cube with 65,000 processors inside it. It was sort of like a very highly parallel supercomputer of the late 1980s. And so I got to sort of program the connection machine myself in a sort of special purpose language for parallel computing. And we had a tiny data set, which was like English sentences to parse trees for those English sentences. And I was trying to train a recurrent neural network to map from the English sentence to a representation of the parse tree. So I had to think about things like, how do you represent a parse tree in a neural net? Okay, and remember, this is like 1988, 89. It wasn't obvious, but Lisp was very popular back then. So you could represent a tree with a lot of like brackets, basically bracket notation for a tree. So it would be input string in and output string out with a recurrent neural network, and the brackets would represent the parse tree. It didn't, I thought it didn't work very well. Like, our data set was tiny. And so my undergraduate advisor kept telling me I should try to publish it. I said, no, it doesn't really work. So I never published it. But it was really fun. I learned about lots of things, about natural language, about parallel computing, about neural networks. And I got excited about neural networks. And it's kind of boring because here I am at Google Brain, whatever it is, 30 years later. And, it's boring and exciting in the sense that I sort of knew I was interested in doing this and work in AI and machine learning. It wasn't called machine learning back then. And I guess here I am still doing it.
How did you get exposed to neural nets back then? Where did you come across it?
There's a great story about that. So I was an undergrad, and I was on a visa. I'm British now, but I was Iranian. I've been Iranian originally, so I couldn't really travel back and forth. And I wanted a summer job, and I wanted to work in AI because I'd read a book when I was 14 that really influenced me. And so my freshman year of undergrad, I went to the head of department, Arvind Joshi at UPenn, and I said, I want a summer internship, or I want a job or something. I can't go back home. I need a job to survive the summer, and I want to do research. And it was sort of crazy, right? That like I would even bother him for something like this, but he was super generous. And he said, sure, I can give you a summer job. Here's your summer job. Read these 2 books that have just come out and explain them to me. That was my job, which was like kind of wacky as well. Like, he was asking me to sort of understand this stuff and explain it to them. The books that had just come out were called Parallel Distributed Processing. These books had just come out. It was like Terry Sinofsky, Jay McClellan, Jeff Hinton. There were a few other interesting authors in that book. A lot of people from UCSD. I don't know if Mike Moser is on. He might have been at UCSD at the time. Jeff Hinton wrote a couple of very influential chapters, including talking about backprop. Mike Jordan featured in that book as well. He wrote an appendix on linear algebra, which is actually really well written, like linear algebra for psychologists, basically. And the book was super influential. It sort of brought neural network ideas to the whole cognitive science and psychology community. And so I did that work, and I thought, this is amazing and this is really interesting. So I continued working, over the summers and during the school year on neural networks and other related things.
Have you asked any of your students to do the same thing? Please read these 2 books and explain them to me.
Well, I haven't done it explicitly, but implicitly, that's how I learn about papers. I often find that I don't have a lot of time to read papers, and so usually it'll be somebody explaining a paper to me, and then I'll go skim read it afterwards, maybe to make sure I've actually understood it or not. It's a good method. It was great for me. Like teaching something is always a good way of learning about something. I couldn't figure out how neurons could take derivatives. Like I thought backprop meant that neurons had to take derivatives. And it took me a long time to figure that out. Like simple things like that just didn't make any sense to me, and it took me a long time. The longer I've been a researcher, the more I've realized how hard things are. So when you're an undergrad, you think, your advisor says, go build a neural network that will do analogical reasoning, and you're like, okay, sure. Which is great, and that's exactly, we want that sort of enthusiasm for research. As you see more things, you think, ooh, that's really hard, and that shouldn't inhibit us, right? So one thing that happened when I was an undergrad was Jeff Hinton came to visit and give a talk. He was already pretty famous because he'd been very influential with backprop, which was already being recognized as a really important idea, as well as Boltzmann machines, another really, really important idea, and a number of other things. So he came to give a talk, and my advisor set up a one-on-one meeting between me, remember, I'm like an undergrad doing an undergrad thesis, and this famous professor, young famous professor who was visiting. And so I explained my undergrad thesis to Jeff, and he gave me a bunch of advice. And then afterwards, I basically followed up with him, and I met him again at a summer school. But the way and then I ended up being Jeff's postdoc after my PhD. But between my undergrad and my PhD, my postdoc, I ended up working with Mike Jordan. And the reason I worked with Mike Jordan was because I worked on recurrent neural networks in my undergrad thesis, and what Mike Jordan was well known for at that time was Jordan networks, which are a particular kind of recurrent neural network. It's kind of embarrassing to him. I don't think he wants to be thought of as being famous for having invented Jordan networks. He's done a lot more exciting things since then. But back then, he had invented Jordan networks. And I'm like, oh, well, I know who this person is, and I want to work on neural networks. People told me I was crazy. Mike was at MIT. People told me I was crazy to go to MIT to work on neural networks because MIT was famous for being anti-neural networks because perceptrons had been published. And, Marvin Minsky was still there and very influential. And, Chomsky was there as well. And he was not against neural networks, but also a big influence and so on. But I went there nonetheless. I ended up being Mike's first PhD student to graduate. So I got to know the lab very early on. We had an amazing lab at MIT. We had lots of interesting people come through. Yashua Bengio was a postdoc there at the same time. And I don't know, the list goes on and on. Josh Tenenbaum was a student who was a couple years younger than me. Lots of good people that came through that lab. Mike and Jeff really influenced the way I think about research.
You've had a lot of transition points through your career. I know you started out in academia, and I think you had said that you wanted to be a professor and stay in academia early on. But obviously, you're here with us today. So could you talk a little bit about the decision points in your career and why you made those decisions?
Let me talk about some other decision points, and then let me talk about the industry and academia decision point. So one of the big decision points in my career was whether I wanted to be a neuroscientist or an AI or computer science researcher. So actually, I was my thesis was in computational neuroscience, and I spent a lot of time, reading neuroscience textbooks, trying to write papers in, Journal of Neuroscience or whatever. And it was actually it wasn't unsuccessful. I mean, I actually in some ways I lucked out, or I was doing the right things with the right people, and I ended up with like a Science and Nature paper in neuroscience, like by the time I was a postdoc. And so I felt like I'd done a lot of neuroscience, but I realized I didn't really enjoy it. And the reason I didn't enjoy it was it's really hard. Trying to understand the brain is super hard, and you're super constrained by the biology, right? Like you might think, I was studying sensory motor control, and one of the things that I worked on during my PhD was a model of how we integrate information from different senses to control our bodies for like movement and things like that. And the model was based on Kalman filtering, some ideas from engineering. the model made really good predictions at a psychophysical level, but then people would ask me, well, how is this implemented in the brain? Which part of the brain is it in? I went to a conference and they put me in a session on the basal ganglia, and I'm like, this is a purely computational paper. Like, I have no idea whether this has anything to do with the basal ganglia, right? It's like it was a very interesting sort of experience, and I felt like I wasn't actually very good at it. I wasn't good as a neuroscientist. And my passion was really to work on AI, machine learning, or sort of the engineering side rather than the science side. And it took me years to figure that out, like to introspect that. So one transition point was figuring out that I wasn't really a neuroscientist. And it took me years to do that. But then I always thought I'm just going to end up as a professor. I'm going to retire as a professor. That's like, why else? What else would I want to do? And so the transition to industry was very interesting. It wasn't, it wasn't like one day I decided, oh, I want to work in industry. What ended up happening was I was involved with geometric intelligence, which Rosanne will remember, the startup was becoming more successful. I'd been advising a lot of companies at that point, large and small. Machine learning had moved from being kind of a purely academic field to something that was actually useful. I mean, many people on this call might not remember that, but like, I was shocked that people thought that this stuff was valuable, because it was so speculative for the first, 15 years of my career in machine learning. It was just an intellectual exercise to advance AI, but there were no real practical applications that were of economic significance. And so when it started becoming more and more practically relevant, and I started talking more and more to companies and getting involved in startups like geometric intelligence, I started thinking about like the larger impact of the work, and how it could really be beneficial to people, right? It could actually produce things that are useful to people. I have another interesting experience, transition point experience around that, which was Facebook actually had a meeting very, very early on, before they'd even set up FAIR, or they had a very small machine learning group. And they invited a bunch of academics, a small number of academics. We all sat in a room, and then somebody got up and said, do you see, like, this is like the user Facebook experience. Everything behind this is driven by machine learning. And it was very eye-opening, right? It was probably obvious in hindsight, but it was eye-opening to see that all of these, technologies were really driven by machine learning. And so when geometric intelligence was acquired by Uber, I started out sort of working very remotely with Uber, but then eventually sort of moved there to build up their AI org. And it was just like a completely new experience for me. And I actually really enjoyed the newness of being in a totally different environment, going from academia, which has a very different time scale and incentive structure, to industry, lots and lots of differences in those environments. And I was thrown pretty much in the deep end there, in the sense of like being part of like the engineering, ending up as part of the engineering organization at Uber, like deeply embedded with like all the leads of all the engineering product teams and things like that. So it felt like, I described it to people as like getting a second PhD. It was almost actually in that environment, it was almost a liability to tell people that I'd been a professor or an academic. People sometimes would look at me and say, did you come from Google? And I had to admit that no, I'd actually come from academia. And that was like, oh, okay. So, the implication was like, you must not know what you're doing. So it was an interesting environment.
Oh, how the turntables turn.
Yeah, yeah.
that took so much courage for you to sort of change your trajectory, because if you're at the point of PhD graduating or postdoc and you've built all your reputation on one field, changing it to another just sounds really scary. And I think these days people are facing this anxiety of like, I've invested so much in this field, probably I've got a PhD from this field, but now I want to probably venture into machine learning or out of machine learning. And people just feel scared of throwing away sort of all the previous accomplishments.
Yeah.
It's not, and back then it's not even necessarily that machine learning offers better career perspective or more promise or anything. How do you think you were able to do that with that courage?
Yeah, there were a couple things. So one of them was I did hedge my bets. So in a sense, even though my PhD was in computational neuroscience, I was writing machine learning papers as well. And so basically it was more like I just shifted the distribution of work until I cut one side off completely. So it wasn't like a radical change. Also, the field was maybe more fluid back then, in the sense that, I mean, one of the amazing things about NIPS, now NeurIPS, right, was that it was basically the conference that I grew up with. It was one of the first conferences I attended. The first time I attended was in 1992. And that community was incredibly welcoming of people from different perspectives and different backgrounds. And that diversity of, at least diversity of research backgrounds and experiences, made it incredibly dynamic and made it so that it wasn't so weird to be a neuroscientist or cognitive scientist, applied mathematician, psychologist, computer scientist, whatever, and be interested in this kind of growing field of neural networks. So, I take issue with the idea that I was brave. I don't think I was actually brave. I think I was in a good environment for making that change, and I had a lot of support.
Yeah, maybe one message to take away is that we should like normalize the big transitions in career, because sometimes I feel I'm now, of course, like a more deep learning person, but in my PhD, I didn't do really deep learning. It was more machine learning combined with neuroscience. And sometimes I feel a little, I can't say ashamed, but like I have to explain like why I did that in my PhD. I'm more hoping to adopt an attitude that, yeah, I changed, like everyone changed, and there's nothing to be ashamed or embarrassed of. It's a learning process, and we gradually find what we like to work on, even though pretty late in our life.
I think, and one of the really important things is to consider occasionally reinventing yourself. Mm-hmm. And so one of the transition, I would say the transition from neuroscience to machine learning was fairly smooth for me, and I had a lot of support. The transition into industry was a much bigger one, in the sense that, especially like where I ended up, I was doing a lot of things that had nothing to do with my research background, and so, but that reinvention, like when you reinvent yourself in a new way, in a new environment, is also very, it's a great growth opportunity, right? It's like moving to a new city. It's tough. You need to make new friends. You need to learn how things work. It's more like moving to a new country, maybe moving to another planet, actually. From Cambridge to Uber was a bit like moving to another planet. You kind of have to adjust, but that's also, you feel like your neurons are growing when you're doing that.
Yeah, I think the most fear people have is like maybe it's too late to make a transition or redefine ourselves. But I think the lesson here is that it's never too late.
It's never too late, and it's tough. It doesn't work for everybody. The other thing I want to say is, I actually think luck. I hate to say this in some ways, but I do think it's important to say. I do think that luck plays a huge role in people's careers. I had many choice points. Like we all have many choice points, and whether you end up in one place or another, it totally defines what ends up happening. If you end up with a good advisor or a bad advisor, totally defines it. These strokes of luck are a huge factor.
Yeah, definitely agree. And one of my luckiest moments is to have met you at Europe's 2015, I think. Yeah, it's like sort of a message to the society that we should normalize how much luck has played in our success or failure, and not to discount them.
Yeah, and I think it has two sides to it. One of them is, we do spend a lot of time idolizing people who are very successful. And I find it kind of laughable. I met a lot of successful people. I mean, a lot of them are very talented, but also I feel like, a lot of them have been very lucky or have been very well supported. And then also, like, unfortunately, society doesn't necessarily help a lot of people who find themselves in difficult situations and, doesn't really properly acknowledge that they've just been unlucky due to their circumstances, where they were born, what happened to them, what environment they've been in, etc. So anyway, that's a meta point, but I think it's worth retrospective. Yeah.
There's this great tweet this weekend that was like, "Oh, we should stop thinking about heroes and geniuses, and all scientists are interchangeable. It's all just where we are in a given time, with certain ideas colliding together."
Yeah.
So, feel free to disagree with that, but truth for that.
I have heroes, but I have my heroes are very flawed in their own ways. Like, I have people who I think are amazing. Let's say they've had some brilliant ideas, right? Where I think, wow, that was just like, I don't think I could have ever done that, right? But then I also know a lot about people and their failings. Like, I wouldn't want some of those people to be, they're good at certain things and they're actually terrible at other things, right? And you kind of just have to take the whole package and think of the community.
Our research world has shifted a lot since you began your career. One of the biggest things has been scale. Are there research areas that you're excited to revisit in this era of large compute?
Yeah. Like many people in the field, I wonder whether a lot of the ideas that had failed, 25 years ago or 20 years ago would actually work now both with large compute and larger data sets. So in hindsight, even like the silly, sequence to sequence parsing model that I had developed for my undergrad thesis, like, I think I only had a few hundred labeled sentences. And, running on the connection machine for several hours was, it was a huge endeavor. And, I don't know, like, that stuff might work now, right? It's with very large data sets. I also think that, there are many examples like this. Like with Jeff and I worked on hierarchical generative models, and it was basically like VAEs, multiple layers. The term deep hadn't been popularized yet, so I mean, I was trying to go to 3 or 4 layers, and it was difficult, right? But maybe it was just like we didn't have enough compute, we didn't have enough data to do this. There are a bunch of examples like this, but there are also things that were super exciting. Yeah, like I did some work early on with Ryan Adams and Hannah Wallach. And when I said I did it with them, it's mostly they did it and I was involved in this. But we had a paper on learning the structure of deep generative models in a completely unsupervised way using Bayesian nonparametric. So it's a marriage of deep learning. It was fairly early on. It's a marriage of deep learning and Bayesian nonparametrics And there was some heroic effort done to get a fully automated method that would learn the number of layers, the width of each layer, and the type of each neuron in a deep generative model. And in fact, the way it was done was kind of cool because with Bayesian nonparametrics, what you do is you define an infinitely large model. So it was infinitely deep and infinitely wide. And then the Bayesian method would actually sample from the space of models of this kind. And it worked, but I don't know if like we just scaled it now, whether it would work a lot better, right? We didn't really try scaling it back then. So there are a whole bunch of ideas littered like this across the path that I followed. I don't know which ones would work. It's very hard for me to tell.
Yeah, but it's like a nice hint to people that are listening or will be watching that to dig out your old work and try to scale them up. Maybe it's a new paper.
I didn't. Yeah, I also feel guilty like distracting people because I do respect people's like intuitions and the work that has happened recently. And I think like given that I haven't spent a huge amount of time reading lots of papers in the last couple of years, like sometimes senior people have really bad ideas. Like I just want to say that. And sometimes like, thinking that you have really good ideas can waste other people's time. But, there is a balance. Sometimes we also, like I'm counting myself as a very senior person, I guess. Sometimes we also have perspective on old things that happened that might be useful.
You've also had a lot of students and a lot of students who have also ended up with Brain. Do you have any advice for people who are mentors of other researchers? How would you suggest they go about cultivating a research group or cultivating a bunch of independent researchers?
Yeah, so a couple of things. So I think being a mentor is a really important responsibility, and probably my top piece of advice is to listen. In the sense that if you're going to be a good mentor, you have to listen to to your mentee and figure out what drives them, what makes them excited, what they're passionate about, what are the research questions they're interested in. And so a lot of it is about listening and then guiding people towards the things that will make them thrive, basically. But being a research mentor is also different from being a manager in a company. I think manager has other responsibilities as well. And one could imagine decoupling, and I think we do to some extent decouple mentorship from management, and we might want to think of doing that even more in terms of the manager responsibilities versus the scientific mentor responsibilities. Somebody can be a great scientific mentor but not a very good manager, and vice versa, right? And so let's just kind of keep that in mind. But yeah, it's one of the things I found most satisfying of my research career is just a lot of people that I've mentored.
I read a passage the other day, and I want to hear whether you agree or not. It was talking about something totally different, like how to be a good therapist, but I find some of the ideas probably are transferable to mentorship. It says that humans have a propensity to grow themselves, to self-actualize. So all you need to do is to create them a supportive and nurturing environment, but also this last bit I really like, to create enough frictions. So like a mentorship, you sort of like you give them deadlines. You're saying you have to make this presentation next week. Of course, they don't like to do it, but like sort of like the accurate amount of frictions is also a good piece to push them to go further.
Yeah. So if you just listen and encourage, that might not be the best mentorship, right? Sometimes you have to challenge people. I've had students that have worked on something, and I've said, I don't think this is going to work. I think this is not a good area to invest in. I think this has been overstudied, or this is just like a bad idea, right? So you have to challenge people. When I was in Mike's group, he was very impressive because he actually really did challenge his team to keep doing better. and that was really, really important. And that's true from a manager point of view as well. Like, you know, if a manager, there is sort of like, if a manager is really, really supportive, that's one side of the job, but also like sometimes, you know, you have to deliver things, you have to get things done. And so being pushed is a good thing. Sometimes, you know, you achieve more, you sort of discover that you're more capable than you thought, right?
You've also moved around the world a lot, from Iran to Spain, and in your academic life to Toronto and Cambridge, etc. Can you compare and contrast the research communities and the machine learning communities in these different areas?
I've described myself as a perpetual immigrant, so I've moved around a lot. And one of the really interesting times of my career was when I had my main faculty appointment in the UK at the Gatsby unit at UCL and then at Cambridge. But I also had a part-time job at CMU. So I spent 2 months a year at CMU in the States. And one of the things I observed is that the machine learning communities were different in different countries, right? They've emphasized different things. It's like research is a social endeavor, right? And so we're sort of shaped by the people we have around us. If you're a Bayesian, for example, and you move to the UK, you're like, wow, you know, so many of the machine learning people are Bayesians, right? It's like a community there. You know, if you're working on, when I was at CMU, you know, there were a lot of people working on much more applied problems, you know, the robotics was a big deal, which, you know, it wasn't in other places. And so graphical models was a big deal in one place. Deep learning sort of evolved in different pockets. The whole neural net revolution was happening around San Diego in the 1980s, right? So this sort of mixing of these research communities and the differences, the diversity in ideas that get pushed around is super interesting. And that's why conferences are a good thing, where, you know, you share ideas, you mingle these communities together.